Cognito, ergo sum. It's a very famous statement. Have you heard it? It's René Descartes' I think, therefore I am. He spoke it in Latin. He was French, by the way. And it was the tool upon which Descartes addressed the issue of certainty. As many of you know, on a weekly basis, I produce a little video series called A Walk in the Garden. And I'm doing that to try and create a place that as people journey through their life and reflect on the way love works in their life, whether or not they come at it from a Christian perspective, they would have a resource from which to at least draw some awareness of that process. Obviously, my developing that series is firmly based upon the faith that we share, but I'm trying to do it at a level where someone who doesn't have faith could walk into that space, hear what's being said, and perhaps be intrigued and follow their thoughts a little further. It's also, I believe so firmly in those constructs and ideas that even as we process those ideas from our perspective of God's grace at work in our life, those ideas will be transformational for all of us. So there's this dual purpose at work there. But in the doing of those things, I very often find myself in a place where I'm thinking about things more deeply, and particularly when I find myself in a beautiful setting like I am today, and thinking about the things that are most important to me and most important to my relationship with God, there are times when I just feel like I need to share them. So that's what I'm doing here. Hopefully this won't take too long. But back to René Descartes. René Descartes imagined that it was possible that everything that he understood about the world around him could be a lie, that there could be an evil God or a demon that was creating an illusion so that everything was false. And this was the beginning of the philosophical process for him. It was, at least it was the starting point. I'm sure he'd been involved in the process for a long time, but it was the starting point of the way that he worked through to what he was hoping to find, which was certainty. So in that journey of doubting everything, he came finally down to the idea that he was the one that was thinking about that doubt. And so therefore, as the one thinking about the doubt, he was doing the thinking. If he was doing the thinking, then he must exist in order to do that thinking. Descartes extrapolated then from there to the idea that he could believe in God because by definition, God as he would know him would have to be a God beyond deceit, because to be a God beyond deceit would make it impossible for the idea of a deceiteless God to exist in his imagination. So therefore he was able to extrapolate from the idea of a think therefore I am to the place of having a confidence in his faith in God. Well, whether that process works or not is a matter of conversation and has been discussed endlessly for many, many years. But that idea sparked for me a thought about something that is much more significant and profound, and it's in the ideas of John Wesley. John Wesley was desiring to have a faith without God, a faith that without God would be impossible. And in order to be in that place, John Wesley recognized that he had to experience God, and that it would be God himself that would speak into his life and affirm the reality of the relationship, that it didn't start with John Wesley, that it started with God speaking into his life. And he called that the witness of the Spirit. So John Wesley at that point was articulating his confidence that no faith that rested upon simply cognitive processes or objective processes was valid, that the only valid faith was a faith that I could embrace, that would actually transform and change me. And this was central to his idea of faith and relationship. It was central to his idea of holiness. That holiness was the product of the relationship with God. It wasn't primarily about the things that we did, even though he spent most of his life up to that point trying to do enough to be holy. He ultimately recognized that holiness was flowed out of our relationship with God, and that it was completely contained in the idea of the heart filled with love. And he called the reality by which that became ours sanctification. Well, to be fair, he didn't call it sanctification. Sanctification is the biblical word for that process of becoming like God, or being made fit for God, set aside for God. But John Wesley insisted that sanctification wasn't an objective idea, that it was a subjective reality. It was an experiential reality. It transformed, God's love transformed us and made us like him, and that was sanctification. He also realized, because of the many conversations with people that he had across numbers of years, that sanctification wasn't simply a process, but that there was this reality of a transformed heart that was the context upon which all other transformation, all other sanctification took place. And it was from those interviews and from that that study and recognizing this experiential reality that he coined this phrase, Christian perfection, the heart purified by faith, or entire sanctification. And then this idea of sanctification, built upon entire sanctification, became what he called the Grand Depositum of Methodism. Entire didn't mean there was nothing else to do in our life. It meant that our heart, our identity, who we really are, was transformed at the core of our being, so that we became like Christ at the core of our being. And from that point on, God's sanctifying process could happen without the resistance of a distorted identity, a selfishness that would flow from our distortions from the fall. So that idea became the Grand Depositum of Methodism, and you move forward 100 years, and there were many people, particularly at this time in the United States of America, that felt like Methodism had ignored its Grand Depositum. So groups of people around the US, and certainly in England as well, began to gather together for camp meetings and for gatherings of people, and different people would come in and speak to this issue of sanctification, specifically entire sanctification. And there were many moments in those meetings where people walked into an experience with God that was overwhelming, and so filled their life with joy and peace and hope and love that it became the feature of this camp meeting movement. And that spawned the holiness movement, which ultimately led to the Church of the Nazarene. Now, in hindsight, looking back, there are many that would point out that there was a lot of extremism in that. There became an idea that was known as altar theology, that if I put everything on the altar, then God would sanctify me. It became very, very formulaic in the way that it was understood. And so people began to struggle with this idea that was captured in the revivalist holiness movement. But we are the product of that journey. And the thing that is most important about that for us is the idea of experiential sanctification. That was certainly Wesley's idea. The holiness movement wasn't at odds with Wesley at that point. And while everything can have extremes, for us to lose sight of this centrality, this grand depositum of the experiential nature of sanctification, is for us to lose something very, very significant. So one of the criticisms of the construct as it became was this idea of two-tripism, the second blessing, the idea that I could be saved once and then have another type of salvation called entire sanctification, that I wasn't a complete Christian until I had those two experiences, has gained in the last 40 years a fair degree of condemnation. But there is in that reality, or that idea, a reality that we dare not lose, that John Wesley understood that we knew God not because of what we knew, but because of His grace and His word speaking to our life, and that it is our privilege to have a certainty about our sanctification, about the fact that we have been and are being made like Christ. And I am certainly confident, and it's certainly been my experience, that there is a very, very significant component that it rests upon us of recognizing the places in our core identity that do not line up with grace and do not line up with love, and for us to lay those at the feet of the cross. And by faith, to allow God to transform us at the core of my being, so that that which informs my identity isn't my experiences, it isn't my past, it isn't my fears, it isn't my failings, it isn't my hopes and my dreams. All these things have been given to Jesus. It's what's called consecration. And in its stead, or at least overarching all those things, is the confidence that my identity is indeed in Christ. And this is what's known as entire sanctification. And I'm certain that as we live in that space and remain in that space, God opens doors for us for effective ministry. It is the power over sin that comes from that relationship with God that empowers our capacity to reflect God to those people that we are embracing. And so my challenge to our pastors and our leaders is for us to recenter our confidence in this grand depositum, in this certainty of the Spirit witness in our life, and in the transforming power of entire sanctification. I hope this message touches your life this week.